Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the QT2 Systems Podcast Series, 10 Tips to Crush Your Next Triathlon. In this series, we are welcoming guests to speak on a bunch of different topics, which all come together to racing your best on race day. For episode 2, we're focusing on the season plan. What is it? Why is it important? And to talk about this topic, I'd like to welcome Coach Eric Kahl. Welcome, Eric.
Hey, Rain, how are you?
Good. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
joining us this
Yep.
evening.
Thank you for inviting me to do this. I'm
Yeah,
excited.
you know a thing or two about this topic. Yeah, I know you have
I
some.
hope I do. Yes, yes.
Yeah.
I think we do.
So I wanted to start with the basic question of what is a season plan?
Okay. I think one of the things that we do really well as coaches is to facilitate athletes on achieving their goal by creating a successful season plan. It really depends on the athlete's ability, the athlete's availability to train, and even more important, what their goal race is. But the way I like to put it is, depending on the event, we might look at 26 weeks or maybe 52 weeks at a time and come up with a big broad plan that will help the athlete get to race day and hopefully achieve their race goals successfully, and even more important, healthy.
Okay. So I know, see, for some new athletes, they look at and say, okay, my race is 12 weeks out. And, this week it's sunny on this day, so I'm going to ride my bike, and the pool's open on that day, so I'm going to swim. Um, this is a little more thoughtful than that, right? I mean, you go through and do more, just a general overview, of what the year is going to look like.
Absolutely. And it's funny that you mentioned 12 weeks because that seems to be a common denominator with athletes, right? They reach out like, I've been doing a little bit, but I have my race 12 weeks or 14 weeks away from now, and I really want to get good. I'm like, well, how long have you known about this race? Or when did you sign up for this race, right? And I think that's one of the things again that as coaches we can really help the athletes is looking at the big picture. So if an athlete comes to you and we only have 12 weeks, hopefully a lot of the little work has already been done. I mean, they have already worked on technique or building their endurance because 12 weeks out from a race, I mean, we're what I like to call sharpening the arrow, right? So we're starting to focus specifically for that race and not necessarily the broad training uh, per se. For example, for an Ironman, I mean, I try to educate my athletes that we need to have at least 26 weeks preparation for that race. But sometimes I'll have an athlete that gives me an entire year in preparation, which is fantastic because we can, the first part of the season, maybe the first 26 weeks, we'll work on, their technique and building their endurance and maybe getting rid of some of the weaknesses they have. So 26 weeks out, we are ready to jump on board and just, start adding some more miles. So they don't break down and they feel good about the training. So it's all about period, creating like a periodization or prioritizing our time or their time training so it's not always the same monotonous training going on.
Right. Okay. So you did just bring up the term periodization. Can you talk a little bit about, what that means and maybe what you would emphasize at different times in the season preparing? Let's just use Ironman.
Okay, so we use an Ironman as a good example. So periodization is where we spend blocks of the training plan focusing on specific things. And again, I'll say some numbers, but they're kind of vague. So if an athlete has some base or they've done some racing, maybe we'll spend, I don't know, 8 to 12 weeks working on their base training where intensity is fairly low, but we're trying to build a little bit more volume so their body adapts a little bit better to that. And then the next phase will be what we call our build phase or a little bit more anaerobic, where we start to do a little bit more harder work, right? Some harder efforts, a little bit higher on their either threshold or FTP levels. And then, for example, for an Ironman, there's not a lot of need to do a lot of threshold work because Ironman is about, the way I like to put it is, it's not about how fast you are, it's how little you slow down throughout the day. But a lot of times, the anaerobic work, the FTP work has such a, a magnetized feeling for athletes. Oh, I want to work. I want to feel like I have to puke. Or I want to go as fast as I can. But when it comes to Ironman, it's really not about that. It's about managing the smaller parts of the day, and hopefully you have a big enough of an aerobic tank in the durability on your legs mainly that you can have a steady, successful race.
Mm. So a season plan for the same athlete, though, might look different if their focus is Ironman versus if it's an Olympic distance race. If they're, let's say they're going to nationals for
Yeah,
Olympic distance, it would look
absolutely. So recently I had an athlete that had a really strong background on Olympic and sprint racing. Did have done worlds, but the plan was to do an Ironman at the end of the year. And I said, that's fantastic. So we had a full year to focus on, but he was a super anaerobic athlete. So we looked at the whole year and I said, well, 52 weeks is a long time to focus on one event. So we came up with a plan and decided to do a half Ironman halfway through the training block. So in my mind, I wanted to capitalize some of that anaerobic capacity that he already had and slowly build his endurance. So the first part of the season, we focused on 70.3 efforts, and he completed that. And then, okay, now the first part of the season is done. Now we're gonna pull the layers back a little bit more, and we're gonna just work on duration versus intensity.
okay.
Right, man.
So we've talked now really on the race, the goal race being,
Mhm.
a factor that goes into a season plan. What else goes into it?
A lot goes into it, right? We sign up for these races sometimes 6 months or 8 months in advance, and we have this clear image. This is what's going to happen day in and day out. But in reality, we know that most of us we have a life, we have maybe a job, a spouse, kids, parents, and inevitably something may derail us from the dream plan. So it's having to be smart enough to understand that there will be some deviations from the main plan in adjusting to that. And I think a lot of times athletes fail when they're by themselves because they don't want to adjust. They just have this outcome goal, right? Um, do whatever race, Ironman or whatever, in a certain amount of time, and they fail to see that if they skip some steps along the way, or if something happens that derails the plan, it will have an effect later on, either in the season or during the race.
Right. So I think there's, kind of two pieces to that. The first is setting up the plan to start with and being realistic about all of those other life
Mhm.
commitments, right? I mean, if you work a job and have kids and are trying to train for an Ironman, you're balancing a lot, right? So you have to I have these conversations with my athletes about tell me like realistically, how much time do you have? And then versus like if you go on, online, you're like, okay, here's this Ironman training program, and it says my long run today is supposed to be 2 hours. Well, I only have an hour and 15 minutes, and you start cutting stuff based on what, but the reality is if you know in advance how much time you have, then you, like, I mean, as a coach, can maximize that time and be most productive with it. And that's, I think, going into it's an important
Yeah,
piece.
absolutely. Like you said, for example, Ironman is not an easy to train event. I mean, there's a lot of things. So when we create a training plan, we're making a lot of assumptions in the beginning, saying, A will happen, and then B will happen, and then we can get to C, and then D, and so forth on the whole alphabet. But like you mentioned, things change. You'll get sick, and you miss a week or two. So what do? Do you just jump right back into it to week 3, or do you kind of back it down a little bit, and make sure that you can get those checks and balances along the way? So, uh, like you said, the things that we do as coaches is that we will adjust the schedule, adjust the training plan to accommodate for that. So we have to be pliable. The athletes have to be pliable to the idea of, you know, if you can't do a 4-hour bike ride, I mean, we can expect for you to do a 6-hour bike ride the next week. So we may have to back things down a little bit to, if it's sickness or injury, to allow recovery, or some balance in life. And I think, and I keep mentioning balance in life, because that's one of the biggest hurdles, I think, for most athletes doing long distance training, is finding a little bit of balance between work and life and kids and spouse. Majority of people work that somewhat standard 8 to 5, so they're going to have to make some sacrifices if they want to train before they go to work. So you only have an hour, maybe 2, um, and then still come home and be present in the life of the spouse or the kids, and then not sacrifice the entire weekend, doing your 5-6 hour bike ride and your longer runs. So it does take a lot of juggling.
Right. Right. I mean, yeah, for sure. And I think, step one is being realistic with yourself and your coach about how much time you have, to start with. And in episode 1 of this series, we talked to Jackie Miller about picking the right race. And that also includes these factors, right? You need to think about what else is going on in life to pick the race that's going to fit within all of that, both timing and distance and location, all that, stuff that goes with it. But now, okay, you're set up. I fill out my questionnaire. I send it to you. I tell you I've got, an hour and a half a day, Monday to Friday, Saturday and Sunday are pretty open. And then you come up with that, that plan.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah, and that's what we do. And a lot of it has to do with, um, what are their limiters, what are their weaknesses, what are their strengths. So, the longer we have to plan for the event, the better it is. And I can't emphasize that enough, is that, the more time we have, the more we can work on your weakness, versus we need to meet that threshold of, you need to be able to swim 2.4 miles, because if you can swim the distance in, whatever, an hour and a half versus 2 hours, those extra 30 minutes make a big difference later on in the day of how well you feel, or how, I don't want to say rested, but how much energy you have by the end of the day, because every minute counts on a 12, 15, 16-hour day, when you're doing an Ironman distance. So the more time we have going into planning the season and creating the season, the more we can work on those little pieces that will affect us later on.
Right. So one question I have is that, for 2 people, let's say you have 2 athletes, they're both racing Ironman Florida, and one of them has been racing for 10 years and one is new, first Ironman. How much do you factor in like past history in terms of how you create the plans?
Good question. Endurance, if the athlete has been racing for a while, endurance is a big factor. Not just cardiovascular endurance, but also the durability of the body, the ability to do, train, for, like I said, for 10 years and hopefully fewer little injuries. That's a big difference than an athlete that comes in fairly green and doesn't have a lot of background training. We have to accommodate for the body adaptations, and that's, again, big part of the periodization is, doing some low intensity work up front, so the body adapts to the extra stress of swim, bike, run, sometimes 5, 6 days a week. Plus we got to throw some strength training in there, and in everything else. So that season, for your example, they may be very different. Two athletes, even though they're starting at the same time, um, planning for the same race, their calendar and their workouts would likely look extremely different in order to customize each other or customize each season individually.
Okay. And sort of on those lines, so let's say now I have two athletes that are similar in terms of experience. Again, the same target race. One of them says, I have 10 hours a week, and one of them says, I got as much as you need. For the person who has less time per week, would you recommend a longer training cycle to get them?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think I would. Um, just because I think our job as coaches is truly to ensure that the athlete shows up at the starting line fresh and not injured. I mean, if you look at the statistics for Ironman, I think there's, I want to say 15 to 20% no show. And majority of those are because people get injured, you know, not just, I mean, injured, but maybe they got in a car accident. But a lot of times the body wasn't ready for all that volume or the intensity, but they failed to adapt to what's happening to the body. And they just keep that tunnel vision of, I need to follow the plan. And something has to give. And a lot of times it's the body that gives. So yeah, I would have two different seasons and maybe even a little longer training plan in preparation for the athlete that has less hours to train on a regular basis.
Right. So, I mean, that I think your answer just brought up two different things again, which is one, that you treat that each athlete needs their own individual
Mhm.
plan. And the second being that if you try to do too much, push too hard, that the likelihood is that you're going to derail from there, or you skipped a bunch of weeks, you try to catch up, and, like getting to the starting line is a
Exactly. I
big
mean,
order.
that's a good point because a lot of times athletes want to do a race that their friends are doing or somebody else that they know are doing. And a lot of times they get caught up with, I want to do the same thing as Joe is doing because we want to train together, which I get that. I've even trained couples before trying to do their first Ironman and half Ironman and an Ironman later on in the season. And it was extremely difficult for me as a coach to manage two different personalities, two different schedules, and two different abilities that yet wanted to do everything together. And again, with your example, a lot of times somebody will um, suffer a little bit more because they're trying to do somebody else's workout, or their fitness and or their health may suffer because they want to keep up with their friend that is doing a 5-hour bike ride when they should really be doing 3 hours. All of that adds up at the end of the day. It's a lot of stress on the body.
Yeah, but I think too that, I mean, when we spoke with Jackie last week, one of the factors in picking races sometimes is because you are friends or family or doing the race. So if as an athlete, they come to you and say, okay, look, my schedule's pretty flexible, but every Saturday I ride with this group and I want to keep riding with this group. I mean, that's something as coaches, we may say, maybe not the best idea, but if it's something they want to do,
Correct.
understanding what that ride is and the intensity and how long it goes just becomes part of the plan, finding ways to make it work sometimes.
Yeah, and you're right. And I think that's something that we as coaches deal with a lot is that we also need to be a little bit flexible with the athlete's needs, that they want to join the bike ride that goes out every Saturday. For the most, I don't have a problem with that as long as we can meet our volume goals. A lot of times in when we talk about group rides, those are not the easy group rides, right? Those are always the fast group rides every weekend. So a lot of times I'll tell my athletes, say, you know what, that's fine. But for example, if it's just a regular club ride, they're normally about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours at the most. But the athlete might need a 5-hour bike ride. I might say, well, why don't you show up early, get an hour in, get a nice warm up on your aerobic zone, do the work that I want you to do, I'll let you play for the hour and a half with the group. And then later on, you just got to go back out and finish the ride that you need to do because the group is not going to be there on race day, right? The club is not necessarily going to be there. So the athlete needs to do what they need to do.
Yeah. So balancing, trying
Yes,
to keep things in that the athlete wants that makes them like maybe was one of the reasons they got into the sport in the first place, keep the fun in it, but also know how that fits in with the master plan and getting them to the starting line healthy and ready to compete effectively.
exactly. And I think educating the athletes and having that open communication as why we do the plan this way and why do we need X amount of weeks of cardiovascular load or why do we do these workouts? I think it helps us as coaches and it helps the athletes want to be more compliant. Because if they do too many harder rides or harder runs or whatever, they're not going to be able to do all the workouts of the week, and then they start missing workouts, and then it's like, well, what came first, right? We got to figure things out. So I believe that just having an open communication with them helps all of us stay within the season plan or the race plan.
So we spent most of the time so far talking about the longer stuff and Ironman.
Mhm.
So what about like if someone is more focused on doing sprint triathlons, is a plan still needed for the shorter distance?
Absolutely. I think the plan is needed. Not, yes, the straight answer is yes. We need to have a plan regardless of the distance of the race. Um, and I think, again, kind of going back to the education point is um, telling the athletes why they need to do maybe a little bit more intensity when they're doing a shorter race than when they're doing a longer race. But also they need to be able to just kind of build that endurance tank or have easy days. So I find that a lot of self-trained athletes uh, train too hard on easy days and not hard enough on hard days. So
Mhm.
again, educating them on why we need to do this and what your numbers are. You should be holding whatever watts or whatever heart rate or whatever pace, regardless of what you know the group, for example, is doing. And that's kind of the harder part to educate them on that.
Yeah, I've had a conversation with a newer athlete that I train, trying to explain why we're not going hard, in January and trying to go through it. And I was like, I promise you, you will go hard. But having that plan and knowing that, the season's broken down and where the timing is like, if you're not racing till July, January is a whole, this is different, the emphasis this time of year is going to be different.
Correct.
So,
And I find that sometimes we just got to give them a little carrot, right? So say, hey, we're gonna at the end of this training block, either these 4 weeks or whatever it is training block that you're working on, kind of let them have a little fun. You want to do this, so let's maybe schedule a 5K or whatever distance it is that can help them understand why we're doing the work we're doing by hopefully having good results uh, throughout the season, right? So I find that sometimes if you just give a 52-week blank with no races in between January and November or whatever it is amount of weeks, they'll be like, oh, there's nothing to keep them motivated. Where sometimes we'll be like, okay, we're going to work on your aerobic tank. And for example, you're going to go run an easy run on Z1 for 30 minutes. Let's see how many miles you get. And then we'll do that same run again 8 weeks or 12 weeks later with the same heart rate, the same effort, and show them that they got better, they improved, they were able to either run longer or run faster with the same effort. And that's kind of how we keep them connected to the big plan because periodization or the big annual plan, it's a big plan. So we need to kind of keep, checking and balances and keeping the athlete engaged on that.
mhm. And so now you kind of brought up another interesting topic is, but what if instead of one race in 11 months, they come to you and they're like, I'm racing every month. And sometimes it's,
Yep.
I've got my 10K, I've got my gravel race, I'm doing a 70.3, and how do you fit all of that into
Correct.
into a
And
plan?
I think we all have that athlete, and I know I have at least two of those athletes, that really want to race every month. Um, and some athletes are able to do it. Let's be clear. They've been doing this for a while, they know their body. Some athletes train better by racing, right? And others race better by training. So that's kind of how we have to work with the athlete, is saying, fine, if you're going to come and we have whatever 5 months and you have 5 races in 5 months, we look at the big picture first, and we're going to help them identify what race is their main race, the biggest race of the season, or maybe 2 big races of the season. And then the other 2 or 3 or 4 will be just training days in a way, or just do a little check and balance. Okay, let's see if our fitness is working. I don't have a problem with athletes racing often, as long as it fits in the plan. If we were talking, for example, for an Ironman, I find that that's important that they do a race up to a 70.3 distance race for your average athlete, like 24 weeks out or something like that, that we can see where their fitness is, and yet we still have enough time to fix things or change things in preparation for the bigger race. And it doesn't have to be a race. It could be a special workout. I know you've heard Jack and I talking about our big bricks or our crazy bricks. Where in preparation for an Ironman, they might do a total of 100 miles plus a 10-mile run, broken down into 4 different training sessions that day. That kind of helps them build their self-esteem that things are working. And when they're not having to travel, they're not getting trashed, but they're still accomplishing I did something big, or I had a race, or I had a great result.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that having those, they're either good to validate that your training is going well, or sometimes you're like, kick, I better we
Yeah.
gotta do something
Well,
different.
and we've been focused on the training part of it, but I think a lot of the periodization of the annual training plan should and must include the nutritional side, right? Because we know that as athletes during off season, our nutrition or dietary needs are a little bit different than when we get closer to race. So having a race or having these big workouts, we can also start to fine tune. And I'm not a dietitian. I'm sure you might have somebody else later on in the season talking about that, but fine tuning those calorie needs or strategies that we will use for the race, or the bigger race, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I think the whole nutrition periodization is another interesting topic that goes with it, and using those, also testing how your race fueling is working by doing
Exactly. Yep.
some races. And so it can, so that really the bottom line here is you can make just about anything work, but you need to know what you're dealing with and put together a plan and have
Yeah, I
that.
think the big take home message is that, like you said, you can go online and find training plans. That training plan might work for one athlete very well. It most likely won't work for all the other athletes that get that plan. And I think that's the difference where we set ourselves apart as coaches, is creating something that's customized for that athlete, and we can adjust the workouts in the training plan and the training season based on the athlete's results and feedback. A training plan is perfect only if it works for the athlete, because if they're not getting the feedback or the rewards from the training plan, you could have had the best workouts ever heard of on the training plan, but it's not working for that athlete. And that's what it comes down to. It's the season planning, or the training plan, or the race planning should be specific to each athlete as an individual.
Yeah, I think that's a really important take home message here. So, well, thank you, Eric. I really appreciate your time today and sharing all of your insights.
Well, thank you, Reem. We'll touch base soon again, hopefully.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.